Hello, everyone. And for those who are further back in the room, I encourage you, if you can, to move forward. Welcome to this side event session, Beyond the Horizon, Forecasting Migration Dynamics Along the Route. For this session, what we want to be discussing here is, in the morning's panels, we heard a lot about the challenges of today's context in which migration policymaking is taking place. And in that context, policymakers also are looking to find better tools to anticipate migration trends and design proactive responses. So here in this panel, we would like to look at and discuss the role of forecasting in this regard, how the different tools can be used, and also in different policy areas. There are many different use cases of forecasting and also limitations in terms of what we can say and based on the model that we used and in the different policy areas. So for example, labor mobility can be projected using demographic or economic data. There's also predictions of displacement that might be driven by conflict or climate change, and you also have anticipatory work on identifying potential vulnerabilities among groups arriving, and also in terms of anticipating potential returns. So we would like to discuss both in this session, so both the opportunities or the options that are existing or that we have in this room and this panel knowledge about, and also some of the limitations. So the idea in this panel is to talk about the different use cases that we have experience with, what are some of the new developments in this field that we have to take into account as we're using forecasting models, and some of the key considerations for policymakers as well. So I want to briefly also introduce our esteemed speakers, starting on the far side with Jean-Christophe Dumont. He's the head of the International Migration Division of OECD. And at OECD, they've recently undertaken a stock-taking and testing exercise of forecasting approaches across various OECD countries. Next, we have Amparo González Ferrer, who's a senior research fellow at the Spanish National Research Council, and in her roles has also been a crucial actor in piloting innovative approaches and uses of data for policymaking, including in the area of forecasting. Jessica Beither is a senior expert for migration at the Robert Bosch Foundation. There, she leads the foundation's work on digital technologies and human mobility. And last but not least, we have Alexander Kjarum, who is a global advisor and senior analyst with the Danish Refugee Council. And he spearheads the organization's work on forecasting displacement, particularly related to strategic humanitarian planning and response. So the structure of the session, just briefly, we'll do a few rounds of discussions, and then if there's time permitting, we'll hopefully open the floor for a short round of questions. So for the first round, what we would like to first discuss is, as I mentioned, there's many different use cases for forecasting. So we want to discuss here the practical uses. So there's a wide range, so anticipatory, so situational analysis, scenario planning, resource or logistics planning, modeling mobility flows. Also in the area of climate displacement, there's important work being done. Here we're only discussing a selection of them. To get an idea on how predictive models can support policymaking and policy responses in different regions and also in different policy areas. So we want to do a lot, and I know with our speakers here we can. So I want to kick off first with the DRC. You've done long-standing work in this area. And looking at countries and regions of origin and how forecasting tools are applied, how and what kind of responses are you supporting in terms of countries and regions of origin with forecasting tools?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk today. So as you mentioned, we've been working in this space for about 8 years now. Initially started in a partnership with IBM. And have now developed sort of a suite of different tools that we use. Initially, we started looking at sort of trying to predict and forecast how many displaced people there would be at the national level sort of 1 to 2 years into the future to really feed into our strategic planning at the country level and regional level, but also to sort of feed more sort of advocacy efforts around the world. And have since then also moved more into sort of subnational forecasting, more sort of timely, how many displaced people will there be 3 to 4 months into the future in the different countries where we work. And so I think over the years, I think what we've learned from this experience is that it's actually possible to quite accurately predict displacement, both sort of with the 1 to 2 year time horizons, but also the more short-term time horizons. So we get sort of quite accurate numbers and a very low sort of margin of error on the forecast. But there are also, of course, a number of limitations that I think is important to highlight here. One is that these models are not very good at predicting black swan events. They're not going to predict your unprecedented surges in displacement. You're not going to predict your Sudan crisis, your Ukraine crisis, or Palestine for that matter. And they also tend to be a little bit conservative, so they tend to underestimate the level of displacement that is going to come in the future. But with that, I would still say we still have sort of good enough results that we can actually use it in our operations. So what we are working quite a lot on at the moment is really to apply it for anticipatory action in the countries where we work. So basically trying to see if we can predict that in 3-4 months' time there will be displacement in a given area. What can we do to support people before they move so that the displacement in itself doesn't generate a significant increase in their humanitarian needs? So that can both be, of course, responding in the place of origin, informing people what are your rights when you become displaced, what are the type of services you can access, what are the safe routes you can take if you have to flee, what do you do if you stumble upon a mine, how do you protect yourself in that situation. But it can also be making sure that people can receive support as they move, and of course also working in the host communities to make sure that when people arrive, there's actually people there that are able to respond to the needs. The host communities are sort of sensitized to the fact that there will potentially be an influx of displaced people. So we really want to use these tools to sort of protect the rights of people and ensure that they can access the services and support they need. So we're right now with funding from the Dutch government sort of scaling up these approaches in 8 countries where we work to really sort of also test a bit out what is it actually that works, how is it that these tools can really inform and make a difference in the displacement journey of displacement affected populations.
Thank you. I'm familiar with the DRC's work, and it's really impressive, and impressive that you also summarized it in such a succinct manner for us here today. Thank you for that. Now I want to turn to a country experience using forecasting to plan for new arrivals. So the Spanish example with Amparo have experience in planning for reception places. And I want to ask you, how did you come to use forecasting or consider forecasting in terms of, and how has it been used in short-term planning of reception and supporting asylum governance at the national and local levels?
Well, thank you very much, Maegan, for the invitation and for the organization of the panel. Basically, I mean, it's quite obvious that for any public planner of reception policies, having some indications, some numbers on how many people will arrive in the next month, in the next semester, in the next year, remains a crucial piece of information in order to secure that the reception system will be big enough in order to guarantee that there are no persons that arrive to the country without immediate housing solutions that cannot be accommodated. And this is crucial to provide the whole society with a sense of control and security that is demanded, but also to be able to guarantee migrants and refugees basic integration opportunities from the very first time, from the very first moment. So even being so crucial, this piece of information is not always immediately available. And it is absolutely necessary in order, for instance, not only to decide the minimum size of the reception system, but also to be able to run efficient budgetary negotiations. When you go to the Ministry of Finance every year, and you need to get the money to make sure that your country will be able to keep and sustain the minimum reception capacity that will provide the local population also with this sense of control and security that we were talking before. So even if this is so obvious, right? I can remember still like 5 years ago, we didn't have that many forecasting exercises that provided us with the very basic numbers in order to approximate that. So for instance, right after the COVID, in the last 5 years, Spain has faced two main migration-related crises, the one with the sea arrivals to the Canary Islands and the one related to the invasion of Ukraine and the flee of Ukrainian refugees to many different EU countries. So if we compare these two experiences, I can still remember how we had to do some, if you want, homemade forecasting exercises, and the two experiences were very different. So in the case of the Canary Islands, we had to rely on the Ministry of Interior statistics on previous year's arrivals and combine that basically with some information scattered and not very periodical on the situation changing in the countries of origin or the main countries of origin that were made up those flows arriving to the Canary Islands. I must say we were quite precise in predicting the number that we will be expecting in the next semester, for instance, but we were not that good at predicting the exact places where these people were arriving out of the total number of Canary Islands. So it was very crucial, believe me, to know which particular island people were arriving in order to design an efficient reception system. In the other case, in the case of the Ukrainian crisis, the situation was completely different. This happened only 1 year after, but we didn't either have any good numbers that could guide us in order to decide how many places will be needed and which part of the countries were the most convenient one to provide a proper reception. And in this case, what we did was to use the geographical distribution of the pre-existing labor economic Ukrainian migrant communities in the country to decide where to open 4 big centers. And in these centers, what we did was to receive most of the inflows into the country and provide the Ukrainian refugees with their appointments to obtain temporary protection documentation. And along with that, we passed them a very short questionnaire collecting information on where they were coming from, particularly within Ukraine, in order to see whether the flows that were coming to Spain were changing regions, and we could expect like growing numbers in the coming months because according to the development of the war, people coming were different, whether they had people left, family left in the country of origin, their return intentions, and more crucially for us, their reception needs, whether they were expected to allocate themselves with some other family members or countrymen in Spain, or they had some reception needs. And we were actually very successful in predicting almost every week the number of people we were expecting to have, and we were quite happy. But these two experiences, in my opinion, illustrate very well how forecasting exercises need to adapt to different routes. That was somehow related to the title of the session. That is why I chose the illustration to realize that it's not only about the number, which is crucial and the first piece of information, but in many cases also about the timing and the places where this number of people will arrive. This is crucial for reception planning. And secondly, if it is possible, some additional information on how changing profile of these people, if they come with family, if they are only men, only women, all these aspects are crucial, and we are improving a lot over the last years in having better information that allows for better policy planning, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really useful also to compare across the different flows that were experienced in Spain, and also the different forecasting kind of approach that you have to take, the different data collection approach, the different policy response, how you adapt to it. Now I want to move to a different policy area. So we want to look at the role of forecasting for labor and student mobility. And I know also there's a lot of work done by the OECD in its recent stock-taking and testing exercise in this area. So for Jean-Christophe, we know for the EU, there's a major issue in terms of future labor market needs. So we hear a lot about shortage occupations, about demographic shifts, and the related kind of labor mobility needs that need to be taken into account in policy making. And I think also that's part of the discussion in one of the panels tomorrow. But I wanted to then ask you, how can forecasting support in planning for these longer term needs?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And let me maybe take a very small step back. I've been almost 26 years at the OECD. I've been in charge of migration since almost 15 years. And I can tell you, I have resisted as much as I could to do forecasting. Because even if I'm coming from a mathematical background, I have a PhD in economics, I know there is probably only one thing you can be sure of is that you start to do forecasting, you're going to get it wrong. But it's also fair to say that in the recent years, two forces push us into that direction. One is, and I think you mentioned it very briefly, this is a rapidly evolving area. Mathematical techniques are evolving very, very quickly, and more importantly, data availability is evolving very quickly. But the second argument to go into this sphere is because there is a strong push by countries. Countries need tools to better anticipate migration, whatever it is. So we decided at the OECD to put together a task force, 17 member countries together, experts doing forecasting themselves, meeting and sharing their experience with some academic experts also guiding the work. And first thing we realized that countries are doing forecasting for a variety of reasons. I think, yes, guiding budget and resource planning is a very important one in most countries. Supporting contingency planning, as in the case of Spain, is also clearly often mentioned. But in some cases, like the US, and the US is the country that is forecasting all categories. Very few countries are doing that. It's simply because Homeland Security is a fee-based organization, so they need to know what their budget will be next year. They need to anticipate how many visas they will issue. But there are some other reasons, like obviously enhancing public communication, or certainly strengthening international cooperation, and we understand why the EU, and with support of GRC, is going in this space to support the pact. What we found is that there are multiple models that can be used of different level of complexity. It starts from the deterministic models, like for demographic projection, very, very simple. Expert-based forecast, basically Delphi survey. What is the most used is time series survey, time series models, or ARIMA or VAR models. We saw also, and that was notably applied in the context of a world population prospect, the latest edition, expert-based probabilistic population projections. There is also what we call agent-based models, which are built on expected behavior of agent put together in a macro model. Econometric causal models, which are less and less used because I think everybody understands that the migration theory behind them is very fragmented and fragile, and this model don't perform very well. And then the two big stream of work that is driving this trend now are Bayesian approaches, which makes experts let's say, elucidation and econometric technique, and machine learning model as one from the Danish Refugee Council. On all that, very few OECD countries are actually projecting labor migration. Japan and Turkey, you'll be surprised. And a few countries are trying to do all of them. France, Norway, Sweden, UK, Finland, United States, as I mentioned, but not necessarily, I mean, mostly using time series models. So these are very, very broad, very, very crude, I would say. I think in theory, forecasting labor migration is simple. Because labor migration, notably in demand-driven system, is very correlated to the business cycle. In theory, this is very easy. Countries are doing that without necessarily knowing, in the sense that when they develop their shortage occupation list, it's a first step towards identifying which occupation will be in demand. And most OECD countries, few exceptions, Germany among others, don't have shortage occupation list, but one way or another, these tools exist almost everywhere. But in reality, forecasting labor migration has not been so frequent. Firstly, because there is not a business case for that. Preparedness or budget question or burden sharing, that's not the point. And if you would like to do labor migration forecasting, it would be to be able to link it to some policy changes that you want to do, and that the models are doing very, very badly. Second, there is one case which is interesting, Korea, Ministry of Justice asking University of Seoul to help them in setting the quota for next year. And so they anticipate the demand for, or unmet demand for labor migration, and then they set the quota in 2024, 10% higher than in 2023. Result in 2024 is that the numbers were lower than in 2023. Very difficult to make that work. Another example is obviously, if you take the example of Italy, big announcement in terms of a big quota for labor migration. It's based on needs that are expressed by employers. At the end of the day, maybe only 10% of the 150,000 places were filled with work permits. It's not easy to do. It looks easy, but it's much more difficult than people think. And there is a number of reasons for that. I will stop there. One is that most of these time series are non-stationary, which means that they don't follow a clear trend. They are more erratic, like the business cycle may be. Second, that these models based on labor migration are using admin data for the most part. And these are data which are much less granular, that data on asylum, which can also build on the situation in origin country. There are big databases on which you can build this model. And third, and I think this is very important, and we don't necessarily always think about that, is that whatever you do on labor migration, it's entirely interdependent on what you do elsewhere or what the others are doing. Open or closing the door in one migration category affect the use and the demand for labor migration. If one country makes it more difficult for talented people to come, for example, by increasing the visa fees to $100,000, maybe the others will get the chance to get a bit more workers. So there are interdependency between category and between countries, and I think we are really at really the initial phase of developing these models, but also of trying to understand what is the business case for that.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you also for the highlighting the key points that I think we have to take into account in terms of where it might not, or where further work is needed, basically. Now I want to move to discussing new developments, because I think this is an area where a lot of new interest has been sparked recently, and a lot of changes taking place that impact on forecasting approaches. So we know that there have been really drastic changes in terms of the international landscape, so thinking about cuts to humanitarian aid, also new crises and conflicts, and also new developments, so the recent advancement of AI tools as well. And it changes some really key considerations with regard to forecasting. So starting with Alexander, in the current context, and also with the DRC being a humanitarian organization, how do you take this into account and other challenges that you see in your work?
Yeah, I mean, of course, these new technologies and the possibilities with forecasting, of course, also comes with a number of ethical questions and risks. I think we have, from the start, of course, again, we are a displacement-focused agency. We've taken sort of the approach that we wanted to just be as transparent as possible. I think that's sort of a first step we can take in terms of also managing some of these risks. So all the models we produce, we put them out openly, we put out the code openly so anyone can sort of replicate, they can scrutinize our work, but also to help us in terms of where can we improve, how can we make it better, and how can we make it safer, the use of these models. We also publish all the forecasts, make them available publicly, so it's not only us that can use them, but any actor that would be interested in trying to use this to inform their work. That transparency then comes with another layer of risk, which is, of course, that these models are misused by other actors that for example, would use our forecast to let's say, close down borders or somehow infringe on the rights of the displaced people. We try to manage that by primarily focusing on internal displacement, so not really sort of predicting whether or not people are crossing a border. And in some cases, we also need to sort of basically sort of safeguard the forecast. We don't put them out publicly, but you can get them on request, so we make sure that it only becomes accessible to actors that have sort of the right intentions, you could say. Another question that arises when we start using it for anticipatory action purposes, when we start actually saying, well, when the model predicts X, Y, Z, then we will actually start activating responses. Because then you could run into risks around sort of false alarms. What happens when the model predicts something that then turns out to be wrong? Did you just spend a lot of money that you wasted that could have been used elsewhere to save lives or address humanitarian needs? One way we try to mitigate that is by saying we only use these models to trigger activities in combination with sort of community level data. So we make sure that whatever the model is predicting, that is somehow also reflective of what the lived realities are in the communities where we work. That, of course, helps also to triangulate and ensure also our own confidence that indeed this displacement is likely to materialize, and this is not just a false alarm being raised by the model. And I think then a last point, of course, is also generally sort of the whole sort of data-driven humanitarian response. While it has a lot of advantages, it also puts a bit our response at risk. Because we all of a sudden rely on a lot of data being provided. Typically, we use open source data, so it's provided by other actors. And while Jean-Christophe said there is, and there has been an ever-increasing amount of data in our sector, fortunately, we may actually be seeing a reversal in some aspects at the moment. So with the recent funding cuts, we have seen, of course, data being cut. All of a sudden, we couldn't access food security data overnight, which is a big part of our modeling. Displacement data is becoming ever more sort of infrequent, and I don't even think we know the full repercussions yet of that in terms of what does the data landscape actually look like next year and so on. Again, the way we try to here again the sort of the community level data again helps us because it offers a sort of a cost-efficient, low-tech solution to enable us to still being able to continue some of the modeling work, still being able to power some of these mechanisms, even if there is sort of a complete data blackout in sort of the worst-case scenario.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for that also. Yeah, reality check somehow also. Now, to bring Jessica in, as your work really focuses on the intersection of use of new technologies in the migration and mobility sphere, how do you see the use of these new, particularly these new technological tools such as AI or others, in terms of what it means for forecasting or predictive modeling?
I'm sure, and maybe also a first thank you for having me and for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. Maybe it's also good to maybe just take a step back about this whole forecasting debate and where it was maybe 7, 8 years ago. Because of course, before the AI hype, I don't know if you all remember blockchain that was supposed to change the world. And then there was of course a time when big data was going to change everything, and that's around the time when these forecasting models, of course, were first discussed, and there was really, I think, a lot of hype and also hope behind it, that if we only would get enough data, then also maybe in Europe or in other places, we would find that missing piece where we could look 3, 4, 5 years into the future and sort of fix our political system. Now, I think that hype has waned, and what we're having today is a much more realistic discussion of what these forecasting tools can do. We heard 3 very, I think, concrete use cases of where if the data and the analysis is used very conscientiously and case-specific, that it actually can enhance the policy process. I would add another maybe area, just to give an example of maybe a broader range of forecasting tools. We have a partner, the Global Center for Climate Mobility. They just recently came out with the Greater Caribbean Shifts report. And as part of that report, it's not a forecasting tool per se, but forecasting elements that use climate change predictions in different scenarios combined with what the economic conditions and maybe poverty rates on different parts of the coastal regions or different parts of islands will look like up to 2050. And that can be really used to say for governments, for individuals to make climate adaptation policies, or for individuals to look at themselves, what am I going to do if I see that these are the prospects? So I think there's very many concrete use cases of what's good. I think, as I mentioned, they cannot substitute for political choices or public diplomacy or diplomatic things. Alex, you mentioned they cannot predict sudden black swan events, and I think we all know we're living in a world where these are becoming more and more frequent, where uncertainty and what's going to happen next month, we don't know what we'll be discussing next year at this conference, but to be very clear where these tools can be used, and that is on the one hand for maybe shorter term, very specific early warning, crisis prediction, planning in disaster or other displacement, for example, and longer term trend analysis, so it can really give us indicators and lights of how we navigate this uncertainty. And if we're very clear in how we use that, then it can be also helpful in the way we design policy going forward, if they are incorporated in our policy decision making. I think we can talk about that afterwards, how good that's being done. But then maybe also just to highlight one specific trend and maybe something to look out for. Again, we're currently in a big AI or die narrative, as I'd like to call it. We must all invest more in AI. But there's also, when it comes to forecasting models, there's what's predictive analytics is now a term that's, together with the AI, is thrown around a lot. Of course, all forecasting models use some sense of predictive analytics, but it's used as sort of, again, a term to mean now we can do so many different things, and I think you need to distinguish there between what type of predictive analytics you're talking about and then what it's being used for. And just to highlight one case that I think is more on the concerning side is that when you begin, and these models are already being employed, is try to predict, have models that predict and make decisions based on individual characteristics, individual behaviors, make predictions about certain points. So for example, and I'll try to be precise, which isn't always as easy, but for example, in law enforcement, when you talk about predictive analytics, right, you can distinguish between spatial crime forecasting, so you want to predict where more property thefts are going to occur, and you make preparations for that. Or you can make predictions on identification technologies. So those are things that are sometimes tested in terms of to estimate how likely is it that that person is going to become a repeat offender? How likely is XYZ, right? And there we're coming into like a little bit more also, ethical challenges and problematic use cases. But similarly in the migration space, you can see both of these use cases now being employed. And so when it comes to this, right, we have set out as Europe, for example, in the AI Act, certain use cases that we deem as unacceptable risk use cases, for example, social scoring of citizens, right, that would assign social scores to all of us, and then decisions will be made on it. It's not compatible with our values, it's not compatible with our understanding of justice, procedural fairness, et cetera, et cetera. You now have a push from, and there are different motivations behind that, to use maybe some tools that are going in that direction in the migration and refugee space for certain use cases. So hypothetically speaking, maybe not so hypothetically speaking, say there's governments who say they have these prediction modeling tools and they're going to use it to mark people for deportation, for imprisonment, for revoking your visa. But I'm not going to tell you what these indicators behind that is. And we're going to start using that as a widespread policy tool. And there, I think the danger that you both mentioned of political misuse of these systems, because I think once you would start looking at the analytics behind it, you'd be very clear that it would not comply with any laws, with any legal requirement, and with any applications of procedural justice. And what is happening there, or what the danger is, also as Europe considers maybe going in that direction, or is tempted to go in that direction, I would say, is that once you use these tools in that fashion, you of course start to legitimize that use of these tools for either all of society, and you simultaneously delegitimize those cases where there's an actual use case behind it. So I think there's a real big political risk in the direction certain development of certain tools are being developed, and I just wanted to highlight that as well, in addition to these use cases that can really add value and where it definitely makes sense to look at the usefulness of these tools going forward.
Thanks for also highlighting, in addition to some of the practical challenges, also the very important, I think, ethical and legal considerations that also need to be in the forefront of discussions as well. So I want to move now to the last round on key messages. So also in this setting, also the key messages that you might have for policy implementation. I think we have already highlighted some key points, but I want to now first come back to Jean-Christophe. We know from this large-scale exercise that the OECD has spearheaded that one of the outcomes that we'll have very soon will be this handbook on using forecasting tools. So I'm hoping maybe you can give us a sneak peek on some of the key messages or considerations that you've highlighted then in this handbook. Yeah.
Yes, I think the handbook is very technical. It's looking at the different models I've mentioned before, the software, the data, and it's very practical for those who are interested to develop models. But it has, at the end, I think, a very important part, which is about, if I can come back to my point about making the business case, or more getting the support from the policymakers to develop and use the tools. And that's necessary. This is very important because it's necessary to understand that this is a costly exercise. It requires data infrastructure that usually does not exist. It needs to develop a culture of sharing information between different institutions, and that's always a challenge. It also requires new staff, because the people who have the skills to develop these models are usually not in public service right now. And it's a learning curve. So it's not that you develop a model and it works like 6 months after and then you just have to roll it out. So it's a long-term investment that is costly. And in order to get, obviously, the money to do it, you need to build the business case. I think for asylum, this is fairly clear, and there is an increasing number of countries doing that. But for other migrant categories, it's not necessarily obvious. At least it's obvious if it can be used by the policymakers. But then comes the second part of the challenge, which is how to communicate the result of these models to policymakers. First of all, they need to be educated, if I may say so, about how to read uncertainty, because that's difficult. We say there is 10% chance that this happens. What does it mean in practice? Should I act upon it? Should I do something now? Maybe there is 20% chance that something less costly happens, but maybe that's better for me, so I look at the 20%. So we need to work with policymakers so that they understand what the model tells and what the model does not say. They have to understand that if the model gets it wrong, it's not that the model has failed, it's that the model provides a range of possibilities, and if you have 1 in 10 chances that something happens, it might mean that it happens every 10 years, and it happens that the year when it happens is this year, but it doesn't mean that the model failed. And certainly there is a lot of efforts to be made, and this is all detailed in the handbook, about how to communicate with policymakers. So you can do variance scenario, you can do probabilistic distribution like the Netherlands does for its migration, for asylum model. You can do risk threshold analysis, you can do risk matrix, risk management matrix. So there are different ways to present it in a very simple way to policymakers so that they can act upon it. But the last element, and I will stop here, is obviously we start this conversation thinking about preparedness, and I think this is very important. But most policymakers, they don't think preparedness. They think policy action. One example is, I think it was in 2022 or 2023, where annual estimation of asylum application in the Netherlands, and this is presented to the parliament, and last time in 2023, I think the numbers were expected to be on the rise, and so hence the call for more support for accommodation. But you know, you can understand in the parliament what the MP have said is, how can I make sure that this is not happening? So it's not about providing preparedness and providing more resources, it's about what policy action can I take in order to curb what you're predicting me that will happen. And I think here, we're going into the Lucas critique from 1976. This is, well-known economics about the role of the model in the prediction of the model itself. And I think one of the challenge for the models, whether it's asylum or labor migration, is that they need to do a much better job of featuring policy changes. Currently, the model look at external factors, and this interactive loop with the policy changes, if I do that, what will be the number, is weak. And if we want to build a business case, I think one area where the modelers needs to invest is in better taking into account policy changes in their prediction. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Now I want to move to Amparo. What would also your key messages be in this regard?
Well, probably coming from a bit different experience from Jean-Christophe, but the ideas are quite similar to my happy surprise, because we didn't coordinate in advance. Basically, in line with what I was mentioning in the previous round, something crucial, absolutely crucial, is to keep collecting more and more frequent data on migration flows related information, whatever that means. And secondly, it's also important to keep supporting those institutions, research institutes, independent agencies that are developing different forecasting exercises using this data among many other reasons, because they are usually perceived as more neutral or not directly interested in the results or the forecasting. And this is also precisely in this time where when, unfortunately, sometimes crises or unexpected results are sometimes blamed on the let's say, limitations of models or predictions or research or capacity of anticipation of science is many, many times related not to that, but rather to the lack of political will of using properly what the models told you. So the lack of capacity to anticipate is in many cases not a mistake of the model, is just a reflection of not wanting to use it with a prudency and with a care that definitely we should. And secondly, well, this in the line that Jean-Christophe was mentioning before is for all these reasons probably crucial to keep promoting collaboration between the administration and the research institution, but also, and many times forgotten, collaboration within the government, within the different units that are not used and not willing in many cases to share the information that they have on the same, let's say, the same phenomenon from different angles, because they feel they will be supervised and judged by their colleagues within the government. Yeah, I think that's enough for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I want to now turn again to Jessica. I think you already provided us some key messages in terms of also the yeah, as I said, ethical and legal considerations. But I also wonder what would be your key messages for policymakers in this area. What should be taken forward?
I'm sure. Maybe also just 3 short points, and you both already mentioned one of them. I think, even though we are living in times that seem to be, you know, changing more and more frequently and uncertain, these tools, if used in a very specific and knowledgeable way, can actually help us work better in uncertainty, right? Either for situational analysis, for early shorter-term warning systems, and for longer-term structural changes. So we know in which direction we want to head, but only if they are systematically included from step 1 in all our policy processes. And I think that's currently still missing, especially if you look on the migration field. The second one, and that's the point I mentioned earlier, is just be also very clear and clear-eyed about some of the big risks and some of the bigger the potential for political misuse of some of these models. So we are not developing something in the migration refugee space because of different pressures and ideas from somewhere that we would never employ in our own societies, right? And so you create a backdoor of actually employing these systems and a digital future that none of us actually want. And the third one, I think we all as policymakers, but also people working on these issues, have to get really much better at communicating about why we are using which models for which purposes and why we're not using other tools and for what. So that we can actually also be very clear that it doesn't become this black box of policymaking where secret models are sort of predicting certain things, that we can just explain this to the general population, to the people that our policies serve, to each other as policymakers, and that we have that communication much better than we do now.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the time. Yeah, so so I'll briefly summarize. So thank you, thank you, Jessica, thank you to all the speakers. I think we've covered really a wide range here. I think what we've talked about are not just the different models, but also the different use cases and the different policy areas that this can be used to support policy making. And I think also the important limitations also across different policy areas. Including political risks, and that those might also become compounded with some of the models or potentially new technologies being used in these types of modeling. But I think there's also from this discussion, there's also some key areas where if if it's used right, if the purpose is clear, this can really facilitate policy interventions in critical areas where there's take-up in a way that also is mindful and discerning about how to use these forecasting models. So I also want to thank all of you for your inputs and your time, and thank you to the audience for also being here. And I think we still have a little bit of time in the lunch. In case there are questions, please feel free to engage any of us directly. So thank you very much, and I hand over.